The accusation? The summons came in the middle of fifth period, advanced algebra. Mrs. Davies, a woman whose perfume always smelled vaguely of mothballs and disappointment, paused mid-equation, her chalk poised like a weapon. Imani Jones, you're wanted in Principal Stern's office. Immediately. Imani felt a flush creep up her neck. Stern's office was not a place for pleasantries. Her mind raced, cataloging potential offenses. A late library book? A misplaced permission slip? She prided herself on her meticulousness, but even the most organized systems had cracks. Stern, a man whose handshake could crack walnuts, didn't offer her a seat. He stood behind his massive oak desk, its surface polished to a blinding sheen, reflecting the fluorescent lights like a malevolent mirror. Beside him stood Tiffany Worthington, her face a mask of tearful indignation, a tiny, embroidered handkerchief clutched in her manicured hands. Imani, Stern began, his voice a low rumble. Tiffany's purse has gone missing. A very expensive purse. And witnesses claim they saw you near her locker this morning. The air in the room thickened. Imani's analytical mind, usually her greatest asset, struggled to process the absurdity. Tiffany's locker? She hadn't been near the senior wing all day. That's not true, Imani stated, her voice steady despite the tremor in her stomach. I was in the library before first period, then directly to homeroom. Tiffany sniffled theatrically. Don't lie. I saw you. Lurking. You're always lurking. Lurking. The word stung. It was the kind of word people used when they didn't want to say other. Other meaning different. Other meaning less. Tiffany, please, Stern said, though his tone held no real reprimand. He turned back to Imani, his gaze unwavering. The purse is a limited edition Valentino. Very distinctive. Have you seen it, Imani? Imani met his gaze, refusing to flinch. No, Principal Stern. I haven't seen it. And I certainly didn't take it. The call home was worse. Imani could hear the controlled panic in her mother's voice, the way her accent thickened under stress. Imani, baby, what's going on? A purse? A Valentino? Valentino. A name whispered with reverence in magazines, a world away from their cramped apartment and her mother's 2 jobs. Mama, I didn't do it. They're saying I was near Tiffany's locker, but I wasn't. Okay, baby, okay. I believe you. But... a lawyer? We can't afford a good lawyer. The line crackled with static, mirroring the chaos in Imani's own thoughts. That evening, instead of tackling her chemistry homework, Imani found herself at the public library, surrounded by towering shelves of law books. She devoured texts on theft, circumstantial evidence, and due process. Legal jargon swam before her eyes, mens rea, corpus delicti, but she pressed on, driven by a desperate need to understand the system that had suddenly turned against her. She scanned the index of a thick, dogged volume, her finger tracing the fine print until she found it. False accusation. Her heart leaped. There had to be a way to fight this, to prove her innocence. To prove she wasn't just lurking. She wasn't just other. A courtroom gambit. The stale tang of institutional coffee mingled with the sharp scent of apprehension in the courtroom. Imani, seated beside her assigned counsel, Mr. Abernathy, felt the vice of injustice tighten. Her defender, scarcely older than herself, projected a frantic air, his ill-fitting suit accentuating his youth. He rustled through documents, a whirlwind of nervous energy, yet his gaze seemed to skip across the page. Miss Jones, he muttered, avoiding eye contact. The prosecution, they've built a compelling narrative. There's eyewitness accounts, and the purse recovered near, well, the scene. Imani's jaw hardened. I told you, I wasn't near Tiffany's that day. I was at the library, cramming for a physics exam. Abernathy exhaled heavily, raking a hand through his already tousled hair. I understand, but without substantiating evidence, it's an uphill battle. I'm leaning towards a plea bargain. Petty theft, maybe? Some community service? A lesser charge? Her thoughts bucked. This was no mere misunderstanding, it was a calculated setup. She refused to be bullied. The unfairness was suffocating. "No," Imani declared, her voice a steady thread despite trembling fingers. "I'm not admitting guilt to anything." Judge Thompson, a figure hewn from granite, swept into the room, his robe billowing like a storm cloud. Years of trials had etched lines into his face, a roadmap of legal skirmishes. He settled onto the bench, his gaze sweeping over the assembly, pausing briefly on Imani before moving on. Case number 2023 CR 472, the State vs. Imani Jones. The bailiff intoned. Abernathy gave Imani a nudge. "All right, Miss Jones, let me take the lead." As Abernathy stammered through his opening remarks, his discomfort radiating outward, a wave of resolution washed over Imani. This was inadequate. Her future was on the line. "Your Honor," Imani interjected, rising. The courtroom fell silent, every eye fixed on her. Judge Thompson's brows arched, a flicker of surprise momentarily softening his craggy features. "With respect, I wish to dismiss my appointed counsel and represent myself." A collective murmur rippled through the room. Abernathy stared, dumbfounded. Thompson leaned forward, his countenance hardening once more. "Miss Jones," he rumbled, his voice a low thunder. "Are you fully aware of the gravity of these charges? Self-representation is a perilous undertaking." "Yes, Your Honor, I understand," Imani responded, meeting his gaze without faltering. "I am confident in my capacity to present my own case." Judge Thompson scrutinized her, his eyes narrowed like slits. He saw beyond the young woman accused of a crime, he saw a flicker of intellect, a quiet tenacity. He glimpsed the echo of his own youthful self, fervent and idealistic, a self long buried beneath layers of legal maneuvering and compromised ideals. He cleared his throat, the sound surprisingly loud in the ensuing silence. "Miss Jones, I strongly advise against this course of action. You lack formal legal training." "But I possess the truth, Your Honor," Imani countered, her voice ringing with unwavering conviction. "And I believe that is the most formidable weapon of all." A ghost of a smile touched Judge Thompson's lips before vanishing. "Very well, Miss Jones. But expect no leniency from this bench. You will be held to the same exacting standards as any licensed attorney. Understood?" "Yes, Your Honor." "It is so ordered," Judge Thompson affirmed, bringing down his gavel. "Let the record reflect that the defendant, Imani Jones, will proceed pro se." "We shall proceed." The sharp thud of the gavel reverberated in the hushed chamber, solidifying Imani's bold act. The battle lines were drawn. Skepticism and strategy. Judge Thompson leaned back in his high-backed chair, the leather creaking a mournful protest. He tapped a pen against the edge of his desk, the rhythmic sound a counterpoint to the murmur in the courtroom. "This is becoming a circus," he muttered, just loud enough for his bailiff, a man built like a brick privy named Earl, to hear. "Letting this girl, represent herself. Pure folly." Earl, ever the pragmatist, simply shrugged. "She's not making it easy for the prosecution, Judge. That Henderson kid's sweating bullets." Thompson glanced at Imani, standing confidently before the witness stand. She was questioning Brittany, Tiffany's best friend, about the precise location of Tiffany's purse when it allegedly disappeared. "Miss Miller, you testified earlier that the purse was on the table nearest the window. Is that correct?" Brittany, a girl whose nervous energy vibrated visibly, swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am. That's what I said." "And you had a clear view of that table, did you not?" Imani pressed, her voice calm, almost conversational. "Yes. I mean, mostly. There were people milling around." "Milling around," Imani repeated, her eyes flickering towards the jury. "So, your view wasn't entirely unobstructed? Could someone have taken the purse without you seeing them?" The prosecutor, a young man named Mr. Davies, rose to object, but Thompson waved him down. He was beginning to see a pattern. Imani wasn't grandstanding, she was meticulously dismantling the prosecution's narrative, brick by painstaking brick. He remembered his days at Yale, the late nights fueled by instant coffee and the burning desire to make a difference. He thought of the compromises he'd made since then, the ethical corners he'd cut to climb the judicial ladder. A bitter taste rose in his throat. Imani continued. And you, Miss Miller, were busy, what was it? Showing off your new nail art to Tiffany and Jessica? Brittany flushed crimson. I might have been. Thompson sighed. This was precisely why he preferred cases with seasoned lawyers. Predictable, controlled. This amateur hour was giving him a headache. He flashed back to a cramped room overflowing with textbooks and legal pads. Imani, hunched over, highlighting passages with ferocious intensity, muttering legal jargon under her breath. Hearsay. Circumstantial evidence. Burden of proof. The memory was sharp, almost painful. She wasn't just winging it. Back in the courtroom, Imani was now questioning Jessica, another of Tiffany's friends. Miss Peterson, did you see Imani Jones take Tiffany's purse? Jessica hesitated, her eyes darting to Tiffany, who sat stiffly in the front row. I think so. It was kind of fast. Kind of fast? Imani echoed, raising an eyebrow. Could you describe what you saw? Specifically? Jessica stammered. Well, I saw Imani, she was near the table, and then Tiffany's purse was gone. But you didn't actually see her take it? Imani persisted, her voice unwavering. Davies leaped to his feet, objecting vehemently. Thompson, his gaze fixed on Jessica's shifting eyes, overruled him. He cleared his throat, the sound booming in the sudden silence. Answer the question, Miss Peterson. Did you see the defendant take the purse? Jessica mumbled, barely audible. No. Not exactly. Imani nodded slowly, a faint smile playing on her lips. The girl was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. Thompson rubbed his temples. This was going to be a long day. And he had a feeling it was about to get a whole lot more complicated. Truth or lie? Judge Thompson tented his fingers, the overhead lights glinting off his polished scalp. He resembled less a guardian of justice and more a taxman stymied by a recalcitrant audit. The courtroom air stilled, the gallery's subdued chatter fading to a near inaudible hum. Ms. Jones, he began, his voice a dry rustle. I find myself skeptical. This testimony, these justifications, they ring contrived. Imani's gaze met his, steady and unbroken. Contrived? Did he truly believe she was performing? The sheer inequity of the accusation burned. She fought to maintain an outward calm, knowing he sought any tell, any sign of deception. She would deny him that satisfaction. He exhaled heavily, the sound echoing the burden of countless flawed judgments. We could prolong this charade for days, summon a procession of witnesses, dissect every nanosecond of your afternoon. But frankly, Ms. Jones, my patience wanes. I suspect yours does as well. Imani remained silent, waiting for him to reveal whatever peculiar notion had seized his mind. Therefore, I propose an alternative. He paused, allowing the silence to swell with anticipation. A wager if you prefer. Truth or fiction. A wave of shocked whispers swept through the courtroom. Mr. Abernathy, her counsel, sputtered aghast. Your Honor, with the greatest deference, that is profoundly unorthodox. Judge Thompson dismissed him with a curt wave. Acknowledged, Mr. Abernathy. However, I also seek expediency. I shall pose a series of questions to Ms. Jones. She will answer, honestly or dishonestly, as she chooses. Should I detect a falsehood based on her effect, her phrasing, any perceived inconsistency, I will rule against her. Should I find her credible, I shall dismiss all charges. Imani's thoughts raced. It was a snare, of course. An absurd, prejudiced, utterly unbalanced snare. He depended on his own skewed assumptions, his instinctive bias against a young black woman from the South Side. And yet, it presented an opening. A chance to expose the preposterous nature of the accusation, to confront his prejudice with her own intellect. She sought her mother's face in the gallery, finding it etched with concern. She caught Tiffany's self-satisfied smirk across the aisle. This was lunacy. But perhaps, just perhaps, lunacy was precisely the antidote required. She inhaled deeply. I accept, Your Honor. The room erupted in chaos. Gasps, murmurs, outright objections filled the air. Mr. Abernathy appeared on the verge of apoplexy. But Imani stood resolute, her gaze locked on Judge Thompson's. He seemed almost taken aback by her consent. Perhaps he anticipated her capitulation. He was profoundly mistaken. He leaned forward, his stare piercing. "Very well, Miss Jones. Let the game commence. Round 1, the test begins." The gavel slammed down, a sharp report that echoed in the cavernous courtroom. Judge Thompson, perched high on his bench, fixed Imani with a gaze that felt like an arctic wind. "Miss Jones," he said, his voice raspy, betraying the years of courtroom battles etched onto his face. "Let's cut to the chase. Did you or did you not steal the diamond bracelet from Miss Vandergelt's boutique?" Imani met his gaze, her own unwavering. The fluorescent lights hummed above, casting a pale glow on the polished wood of the defendant's table. She took a slow, deliberate breath, the scent of old books and simmering tension thick in the air. "Judge Thompson," she began, her voice clear and strong, surprisingly steady despite the knot of anxiety twisting in her stomach. "The prosecution alleges that I was seen leaving Vandergelt's with a bracelet matching the description of the stolen item." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Thompson raised a hand, silencing it with a flick of his wrist. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. "Is that a denial, Miss Jones?" "It's context, Your Honor," Imani replied, her voice calm but firm. "I was indeed in Vandergelt's that afternoon. I was admiring a particularly exquisite display of costume jewelry. However, I purchased a silver locket, a receipt for which I believe has been entered into evidence. What the prosecution conveniently omits is the fact that dozens of people were also in the store that day, and that the matching description they offer is incredibly vague. Plenty of bracelets sparkle." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. She could feel the weight of the courtroom's attention, the collective breath held in anticipation. "To answer your question directly, Judge Thompson, no, I did not steal a diamond bracelet from Miss Vandergelt's boutique. What I did do was spend my hard-earned money on a beautiful locket, which I am happy to show the court, if it pleases." A wave of whispers erupted, louder this time. Thompson's face was unreadable, a mask of judicial impassivity. Imani noticed a slight twitch in his jaw, a flicker of something, surprise perhaps, in his eyes. He looked down at the papers in front of him, shuffling them with a decisive snap. Had she planted a seed of doubt? It was impossible to tell. The prosecutor, a young man with gelled hair and a perpetually indignant expression, shifted uneasily in his seat. He had clearly expected a simple denial, something he could easily bat down with his rehearsed arguments. Imani had thrown a wrench in his well-oiled machine. Thompson finally looked up, his gaze piercing. "Miss Jones," he said, his voice lower now, almost conversational, "you're a remarkably articulate young woman. It's a shame we're meeting under these circumstances." He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "The court will take a brief recess." He banged the gavel again, the sound slicing through the stunned silence. Turning the tables. "With all due respect, Your Honor," Imani said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the oppressive silence of the courtroom. "May I ask a question?" Judge Thompson, who had been leaning back in his oversized leather chair, looking as if he'd rather be anywhere else, straightened up abruptly. His jowls seemed to tighten. "That depends, Ms. Jones. I am not here for a game of 20 questions. It pertains directly to the disciplinary code of Northwood High, the very code upon which my suspension is supposedly based." Imani's eyes, usually sparkling with youthful enthusiasm, now held a steely resolve. A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. Imani's mother, seated in the front row, gripped her purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. This wasn't the plan. They hadn't discussed this. But in her eyes, a flicker of hope ignited, fueled by her daughter's unwavering confidence. Judge Thompson sighed, a sound heavy with weariness. He pinched the bridge of his nose. "Ms. Jones, I am familiar with the Northwood High Disciplinary Code. It is not particularly complex. Ask your question, but make it quick." "Thank you, Your Honor." According to Section 3(2), subsection B, paragraph 7, a student can only be suspended for disruptive behavior that significantly impedes the educational environment. My question is this: does that section define significantly impedes? The courtroom held its breath. Judge Thompson's face flushed a mottled red. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the leather creaking in protest. He shuffled through the papers in front of him, a forced, deliberate movement. That is irrelevant, Ms. Jones, he finally stammered. The administration clearly deemed your actions disruptive. Imani pressed on. But doesn't the lack of a clear definition allow for subjective interpretation, Your Honor? Doesn't it allow for biases to influence the application of the rules? For example, Imani paused, her gaze unwavering. If a student from a privileged background challenged a teacher, wouldn't that be viewed differently than if a student from the Southwood district, like myself, did the same? A gasp escaped from someone in the gallery. Even the court stenographer seemed to pause, her fingers hovering over the keys. Judge Thompson's eyes narrowed. He leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. Are you accusing this court of bias, Ms. Jones? No, Your Honor, Imani replied, her voice calm and measured. I am merely asking for clarification on the application of the Northwood High Disciplinary Code. If significantly impedes is not defined, how can we ensure fair and equal treatment for all students, regardless of their background? The judge's face was now a mask of barely controlled fury. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, as if searching for the right words that wouldn't expose the chasm that Imani had just illuminated. He glanced at the prosecuting attorney, who stared back, equally speechless. Imani's mother felt a surge of pride so potent it almost brought tears to her eyes. Her daughter was not just defending herself, she was challenging the system itself. The setup revealed. Okay, Imani, Judge Thompson sighed, running a hand over his thinning hair. The fluorescent lights hummed above, casting a sterile glow on the makeshift courtroom. One more question. Make it count. He was tired. This whole charade was ridiculous. A stolen purse, a schoolgirl. He dealt with hardened criminals, seen real injustice. This felt like a waste of his time. Imani met his gaze, her expression calm despite the pressure. Truth or lie, did Tiffany Peterson feel threatened by my academic performance in history class? A collective murmur rippled through the room. Tiffany, sitting with her arms crossed, shifted uncomfortably. Judge Thompson raised an eyebrow, a flicker of curiosity replacing the boredom in his eyes. This was a left turn. Lie, Tiffany snapped, her voice tight. Imani smiled, a small, knowing smile. Then explain why you told Maria Rodriguez that I was only getting good grades because Mr. Abernathy had a thing for me? Tiffany's face flushed crimson. That's hearsay. Hearsay maybe, but is it true? Imani pressed. Did you say it because I got a higher score than you on the midterm? Tiffany squirmed. So what if I did? It doesn't mean anything. It means you were jealous. Imani countered, her voice gaining strength. Jealous enough to want to discredit me. Jealous enough to plant Mrs. Davison's purse in my locker. The air thickened. Judge Thompson leaned forward, the weariness momentarily gone from his face. This wasn't just a petty squabble. He hadn't seen this coming. I didn't! Tiffany shrieked, her voice cracking. Why would I do that? Because Mrs. Davison specifically said she saw a girl with braids near her locker before the purse disappeared. Imani said, her eyes fixed on Tiffany. And I saw you, Tiffany. I saw you hurrying away, clutching something to your chest. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Tiffany's composure crumbled. She began to sob, a high-pitched, desperate sound. It was a stupid joke. I didn't mean for it to go this far. The room was silent. Judge Thompson stared at Tiffany, his face hardening. He glanced at Imani, seeing not a guilty defendant, but a victim. He thought of all the times he'd rushed to judgment, relying on appearances, on gut feelings. How many times had he been wrong? Tiffany Peterson, Judge Thompson said, his voice resonating with a newfound authority. I advise you to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you. He looked at Imani, a glimmer of something akin to respect in his eyes. Case dismissed. A judge's reckoning. The courtroom air hung, a suffocating blanket. Imani stood rigid, her attention directed beyond the vibrant hues of the justice-stained glass, a fixed point of strength. In stark contrast, Judge Thompson seemed to deflate within his judicial robes. The sheer force of Imani's testimony, coupled with irrefutable digital proof and her meticulously constructed timeline, had visibly eroded his composure. He had witnessed countless deceptions and desperate pleas within those walls, but never such a complete evisceration of a false narrative. He cleared his throat, the rasp echoing through the stifling space. "Mr. Davies," he addressed Marcus, the accusing classmate now a hunched figure in his seat, eyes glued to the floor. "Anything further you wish to offer?" A mumbled response, lost in the stillness. "Speak clearly, son," Thompson commanded, his voice recovering some of its previous authority, though the sharp edge was blunted. Marcus finally raised his head, his complexion ashen, the beginnings of tears carving tracks down his cheeks. "It wasn't meant to escalate this far," he stammered, his voice cracking with the admission. "Just a joke. A prank." A fleeting glimpse of remorse flickered across his face as he looked towards Imani. "I never imagined. I didn't think they'd take it seriously." His confession lingered, a venomous cloud. A chill of foreboding settled in Thompson's gut. He had nearly allowed a boy's callous prank to shatter an innocent life. "Who constitutes we?" he inquired, his tone now dangerously even. Marcus unspooled the details of the conspiracy, naming names, exposing the network of classmates who had stoked the rumor and aided in fabricating the evidence. It was a spiteful, small-minded act, born of envy, and Thompson realized with a sickening jolt, something far more insidious, a prejudice he had grown dangerously complacent in ignoring. The silence that followed was a palpable weight, crushing down harder than before. Thompson's gaze drifted to Imani, her expression an impenetrable mask. He had judged her so wrongly. He had allowed the color of her skin, her place of origin, to taint his perception of her character. A wave of self-disgust washed over him. How many others had suffered under the weight of his presumptions? He rose, his movements ponderous, revealing both his age and the accumulated burdens of regret. "Ms. Jones," he began, his voice raspy with contrition, "I am in your debt for an apology. A sincere one. I permitted my own biases to obscure my judgment. I neglected a critical examination of the presented information, and I nearly committed a grave injustice." He looked directly at Imani, meeting her steady gaze. "I offer you my deepest apologies." He sank back into his chair, burdened by the weight of his pronouncements and the system he embodied. "This court," he declared, his voice strengthened, now imbued with a newfound conviction, "finds Ms. Imani Jones not guilty. Furthermore, I intend to launch a thorough inquiry into the deeds of Mr. Davies and his co-conspirators, and to scrutinize the systemic shortcomings that permitted this travesty to unfold in the first place." He paused, his gaze sweeping the courtroom. "This ends here." The stained glass justice seemed to glow in the afternoon light, transformed from a passive observer into a vigilant, scrutinizing presence. And Judge Thompson, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, felt capable of meeting her gaze squarely. Justice served. The courtroom air hung thick and heavy, a palpable tension Imani could almost taste. Judge Thompson, his expression an inscrutable mask, shuffled the documents before him, the whisper of paper amplified in the stillness. He seemed aged by days, worry etched deeper into the crags around his eyes. "Ms. Jones," he began, the steel absent from his tone, "the prosecution has rested its case. Upon careful review, I find the evidence wanting." A ripple of hushed surprise swept through the gallery, and Imani felt her pulse quicken. Judge Thompson continued, his gaze lost on a point somewhere beyond her. "The prosecution's argument hinges on circumstantial threads and unsubstantiated accusations. Conversely, Ms. Jones has offered a compelling rebuttal, providing a context that significantly erodes the prosecution's foundation. Therefore," He paused, the word a weighty declaration. This case is dismissed. With prejudice. A wave of relief, near incapacitating in its intensity, washed over Imani. With prejudice. It was done. Truly finished. Judge Thompson cleared his throat, a fleeting glint of what might have been admiration in his eyes as he finally met Imani's gaze. Ms. Jones, he stated, his voice now gentler. Your legal mind is exceptional. I confess I underestimated you. Your talent for dissecting intricate arguments and articulating them with such precision is truly remarkable. He hesitated, a strange vulnerability momentarily softening his features. I will be recommending you for the Justice Thurgood Marshall Scholarship Program. It is well deserved. The courtroom exploded with sound. Cheers, applause, jubilant cries filled the space. Imani's mother surged forward, pulling her into a tight embrace. Mr. Davies, beaming, clapped her heartily on the back. Even a few court officers offered smiles. The ensuing days became a blur. News agencies vied for interviews. A deluge of letters and emails arrived, brimming with congratulations and support. But the most resonant moments were the small, unscripted encounters, the knowing nod from the cashier, the warm smile from an older woman on the bus, the hushed, encouraging words from teenagers on a street corner. A week later, Imani stood on a makeshift platform in her former middle school's auditorium, a microphone clutched in her hand. The room overflowed with students, their faces alight with anticipation. She recounted her story, not simply the trial itself, but the fear that gnawed, the doubts that lingered, and the unwavering faith she held in her own innocence. Justice isn't always straightforward, she declared, her voice ringing with assuredness. It's not always swift. But you must fight for it. You must believe in its possibility. And you must remember that your voice carries weight. Never allow anyone to diminish you, to tell you that you're too young, too disadvantaged, or too anything to advocate for what is right. As she descended the steps, a young girl with curious, sparkling eyes approached her. Ms. Jones, she said, her voice full of wonder. I want to be a lawyer now. I want to champion the cause of others the way you did. Imani smiled, a genuine, luminous smile that illuminated her entire face. Then you can, she responded, taking the girl's hand. You absolutely can.